Merkel Media.
I'm exhausted, looking for everything in the shadows. Start looking at people like they don't matter. I'm waking up to the fact, more than a little bit shallow. I'm lost in this hole, but I don't wanna. I'm lost in this hole, 'cause I'm just trying to
What's good, guys? We are back with another episode of Free the Rabbits, and we are back with another part to the Agent Crowley series that's ongoing. And this one is a direct continuation of last week's, but it stands on its own. So it's not a second part to it. It's just another chapter in this ongoing saga that I've been putting together since really the inception of the podcast. So this is just another layer to this very interesting character, Aleister Crowley, and the multi-layered aspects that he represents. This is including him being a secret agent, him also being a magician, and the charlatan. And generally speaking, most researchers will pick one and stick with that when they're talking about Crowley. But I think every single one of those three representations are actually the representation of the whole of who he is. And then there's a ton of different offshoots of those too. So he had a lot of different things that he had his hands in. And we're going to talk about more of when Crowley returned to New York from San Francisco. And part of his return to New York and San Francisco, this coincided with another very nefarious character, Marie Bolo Pasha. What's up, guys? Real quick before we jump back into the show, for people who have been asking how to support the show financially, you can support in a few ways. First, you can become a member here on YouTube. We have 3 different tiers and custom emojis for you to use on this channel. You can also go to buymeacoffee.com/freetherabbits and become a monthly member or make a one-time donation. If you're looking for some great merch to wear this fall and winter, like our new Faith Turns Promise into Prophecy and I'm a Free Range Rabbit merch, go to freetherabbits.myshopify.com for tons of options, and we're always updating the store with new items. And lastly, for anyone looking for any of the films that I've been in, like Expedition Dogman, Sasquatch and the Missing Man, or our brand new film, The Meadow Project, head over to merkelfilms.com to stream them now. All right, guys, let's get back into the show. And his original name was Paul Bolo, and he was a Frenchman who was a Levantine financier, trader, and German agent. We'll talk about him actually being tried as a traitor. Pasha is a title of a Turkish officer of high rank, and that's important. We'll explain how he got that title. And I said he was a Levantine financier. And the Levant is a sub-region of West Asia, and it's along the Eastern Mediterranean, and it forms part of the Middle East. And this has got Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, Turkey, and you can even spread it out further where you'll see parts of Greece, Egypt, and Eastern Libya is a part of it too. But he was a financier, and we'll talk about what his shady hands were involved with here in a little bit. New York Times even said that he circumnavigated the globe and had his hands in many shady schemes, according to the New York Times. And his early life was interesting. He started out as an assistant at a barber shop. Then he was an owner of a small soap shop. That failed. He jumped into selling lobsters, and that ended up failing. And eventually, after a bunch of different failures, he married a woman who was older and rich, and she died and left her fortune to him. And then he went to Egypt as a rich man after she passed. So he was definitely a sugar baby, and she was his sugar mama. So he heads to Egypt, and he wanted to do like a lot of adventures during that time because it was considered the Mecca of where all adventures were going during the late 1800s, early 1900s. And when he gets there, he meets this ruler, Abbas Hilmi, and he was the last Khedive of Egypt and Sudan. And a Khedive is an honor that is used for sultans, grand viziers. And when I was reading into that, I was thinking about Jafar from the Aladdin movie, the Disney Aladdin movie. Little known fact, that is my favorite Disney movie growing up, was Aladdin. I think it trumps all the rest. Not to say that I didn't like some of the other films growing up. Of course, I was a kid and I liked animated films, but I think Aladdin was my absolute favorite. So as soon as I saw he was a sultan or a grand vizier, it made me think about, oh, so this Hilmi character that Bolo met over there was probably very similar to like a Jafar. So they liked each other initially because Hilmi could speak fluent French, and obviously Bolo was a Frenchman. And he was actually presented this title of Pasha from Hilmi. So that's how he got this Turkish officer of high rank title. Now, they get in bed with each other for various schemes and a lot of money being passed around considerably from Hilmi. And it all culminates in this plot because of the early onset of World War I. They want to influence the French media to accept peace with Germany because the French were against the Germans. So Hilmi ends up giving Bolo about $2.5 million, but there's a dispute on where the money needs to be settled because obviously Hilmi was not trying to have the money deposited directly into a French bank. So they end up settling on putting it one of Hilmi's accounts that Bolo would have access to. So not long after this, Bolo heads to New York, and he's there for about a month. And this is around the time that Crowley is also there in New York. And this is all going to be very important because Bolo meets up with Johann Heinrich von Bernstorff, who I've talked about before, specifically in the Lusitania episode. And Bernstorff is a German politician and ambassador to the United States, and he was there from 1908 to 1917. So not only that, but in close cooperation with Johann Bernstorff Dernberg, Dr. Bernard Dernberg, and he was a German liberal politician and banker, they assumed control of the German Information Bureau on Broadway as well. So we've got Bolo who's going there, and he is in contact with these guys. Now, the Bureau was a front for propaganda cabinet. We've talked about the propaganda cabinet. We've talked about Hugo Munsterberg. We've talked about occultist Hans Heinz Urs, and we've talked about George Sylvester Varick specifically in the Lusitania episode. And guess who was tight with all those guys? Aleister Crowley was tight with all of them. And the aim of this cabinet was to counter the Allied propaganda and champion Germany's cause in America. They were trying to stop the Americans from even joining the war, and we talked about this. But we also talked about the British using Crowley to infiltrate not only the propaganda cabinet, but various German organizations to gather information so that they could stir the Germans up enough to drag the Americans in, which part of the Lusitania being taken out by the German U-boat brought the Americans in. One of many things, but it was one of the big catalysts that happened. And Bernstorff, which we talked about, him being this German ambassador to the United States, he was the one, and we talked about this during the Lusitania episode, he wrote this weird article that came out the same day prior to the sinking of the Lusitania. And he talked about how that the Germans didn't need to attack this boat. It was a weird warning that basically was stating that there were dangers of the Lusitania going into a submarine war zone. So basically they were telling the Americans they were about to take out the boat without telling them they were going to take out the boat. So again, if you haven't heard that episode, go back and listen to it. I go into that in more detail. So in 1915, so Bolo comes to the United States. He hooks up with von Bernstorff, and they devise this scheme to destabilize the French war effort by corrupting the French press. And they were trying to force a peace treaty with Germany. As a matter of fact, they wanted to go to the Paris newspaper Le Journal and pump fake news through it to convince the French that they needed to have peace with the Germans. And it was just an easier way for the Germans to take out the French without actually going to war with them. So during this period of time from 1915 to 1917, the U.S. declares war on Germany, and that was on April 6th of 1917, and they severed all diplomatic relations. So that was even including the German affiliations that were already in the United States, any of these diplomatic centers. And they kind of went on a tirade of taking out a lot of these Germans that were in the States during that time, having them locked up, having them sent back to certain countries. Was a part of this, the French government actually reached out to the Attorney General of New York, and they wanted to collect evidence on Bolo so they could extradite him back and then obviously have him prosecuted. And as a matter of fact, the Americans came up with a lot of evidence. They came up with letters, telegrams, telltale checks, all kind of correspondence between him and the Germans, and the traitorous nature of Bolo that was against what the French wanted to do because they were not trying to have peace with the Germans. As a matter of fact, they found out that there was $1.6 million that were given to him by the French so that he could persuade the French newspapers to put out fake propaganda to push the French into trying to have some sort of peace with the Germans. And he actually says in a letter that they found that they sent back to the French, and in this letter, he says, "Gentlemen, you will receive from Messieurs Amsink and Company deposits for the credit of my account with you, which deposits will reach the aggregate amount of $1.7 million, which I wish you to utilize in the following manner. First, immediately on receipt of the first amount, on account of this sum, pay to Messieurs J.P. Morgan and Company." Interesting, J.P. Morgan and Company is getting paid out as well, the sum of $170,000 to be placed to the credit of the account with them of Senator Charles Humpert in Paris. So again, it wasn't that JP Morgan was necessarily up to anything, but obviously they're a big bank and they're moving money around. But it is interesting that JP Morgan and Company was a part of this. Second, establish on your books a credit $5,000 good until the 31st of May in favor of Jules Boys, Biltmore Hotel, this amount to be utilized by him at the debit of my account according to his needs, and the unused balance to be returned to me. Third, transfer to the credit of my wife, Madame Bolo, with agency of Compte National de Paris, a sum of about $524,000 to be debited to my account, as such transfers are made by you at best rate and by small amounts. Fourth, you will hold, subject to my instructions, when all payments are complete, a balance of not less than $1 million. Yours truly, Bolo Pasha. So that proved that he was receiving money and moving money around for the purposes that were being charged against him. And as a cause of this, He was executed by a firing squad in France in April 17th of 1918. So he was waxed out. Now you may be asking, how does this have anything to do with the mage, with the beast, with Aleister Crowley? Well, I'll let you know. So Aleister Crowley and Bolo were actually lurking in Switzerland when the war started in July 28th of 1914. This is before Crowley gets to America for that long run from 1914 to end of 1918, early 1919. And that was during the time that Bolo's running around with the Khedive of Egypt. And that's where he got the Pasha title. And he was also trying to launder German funds through the Guarantee Trust Company, New York, to help one of its employees, Jacques Menodo. And it's very interesting. Menodo was friends with Bernstorff, Dernberg, Varick, who were all tight with Crowley to some extent. And also, Menodo had ties to Chicago, and he had banking expertise, and that suggested the link to who? Alvensleben, who we've talked about, good old Alvo, who Crowley was working for to extract all of his wealth from Canada and get it to Washington State. So Crowley was tied up with all of this very, very interesting web that Bolo Pasha was spinning from the very get-go. I mean, he was literally over in Switzerland when Bolo was moving in and out through Europe. And around the same time, Menodo was also arrested by the Bureau of Investigation as a German agent as well. So the thought pattern is that the way that this information was leaked out, or at least Crowley was able to extract information from all of these men and get it back to the British, which the plan was always for the British to gas up the Americans to drag them into the war. So this is just another example of Crowley being right next to all of this insanity that's going on. And again, being friends, being close with all these guys, but yet not he himself being arrested. So again, a gatherer of information in this particular instance, but was involved seemingly nonetheless. So part of the next phase of the beast was, and his return to New York, was finding some new Scarlett Women. And I say women because he had multiples this time, and he was coming off this trip, when he left New York the first time, headed to Detroit, then he headed up to Canada, and then he ended up in San Francisco and LA and some other places. Well, on his way back, he had ended his romance with Jean Foster. And part of the reason why he said that she betrayed him is because she said she wanted to stay with her husband. Hilarious. But that's kind of how Crowley rolled. Crowley would be involved with these women who had husbands, and a lot of those husbands were perfectly fine with them messing around with Crowley. Some of those husbands, they themselves were involved in the occult. Some of them were just older and didn't care. And these women were highly involved with sex magic with Aleister Crowley. But this was one of those instances, but she decided that she would leave Crowley in LA, and then she returned home to her husband. So he took that as a betrayal. But when he returns to New York, he's still got Layla Waddell, who we've talked about plenty of times in this series. But he starts two simultaneous affairs with two other women, and they both involve sex magic as well. And the first was Gerda Marie von Kothek, and she was a German prostitute, and she was called Brilliant Young Angel of Revolution. And her real name was Gerda Schumann, and she was 19 when she met Crowley. A little bit before or after, and we don't know specifically, because obviously some of this we're looking at the Confessions, which is Crowley's autobiographical work. And it seems to be that, again, a little bit before or after that she met Crowley, she marries this German immigrant, Dr. Rudolf Gebauer, and they take up residence in New Jersey. And he is, guess what, a chemist employed by a nearby plant. We talked about Crowley's affinity for being around people who are chemists and pharmaceuticals. But Gebauer, when he marries Gerda, he knows that she's got all these radical ideas and he's sympathetic to it, but he doesn't really care. But why would Crowley want to mess with this German prostitute outside of the fact for sex magic? We always have to look at that other layer if we're looking at Crowley being a secret agent. Well, Gebauer had ties to a German radical newspaper called the New Yorker Volkszeitung, and it was run by a socialist called Ludwig Lohr. And Ludwig Lohr was an American Socialist magazine editor, newspaper writer, lecturer, and politician. And he was a faction leader in the early American communist movement. Now, Lohr's anti-war publication, when he was publicating for the Volkszeitung, he would put out propaganda trying to keep the Americans out of the war. And come to find out, he had ties to propaganda cabinet and the Fatherland, which was the propaganda publication that Aleister Crowley also wrote for. So very interesting that here's more ties to Hugo Munsterberger. We've got Heinz Urs, who we talked about, and George Sylvester Varick. And these are all tied into Crowley. And so what also spun out of this was not only Crowley using Gebauer to keep eyes on what all of the Germans were doing, and obviously the Volkszeitung newspaper and what they were putting out so he could retrieve the information to take it back to the British. But we've also got another interesting piece where the Bureau of Investigation, they took a special interest in Gebauer in April of 1917. So there was this unnamed source that claimed that he was in league with von Bernstorff, von Papen, who we'll talk about in a little bit too, and several other German plotters, but they looked into it and they realized there wasn't any evidence to be able to arrest him. But the funny part of that story is here's that charlatan side of Crowley peeping out. The idea is that Crowley was the one that provided the Bureau of Investigation that so he could get Gebauer out of the way so he could have more access to his wife, who he wanted for sex magic. So again, there's that selfish side of Crowley too. Not everything that he did was for British intelligence. Far from it. As a matter of fact, I believe that he used British intelligence just as much as British intelligence used him, along with several other intelligence agencies, not just with the British, but in the United States and the Germans as well. And the other tie-in with the Gebauer was his membership to the German University League. And a leading member was Hugo Munsterberg, who we've talked about, and he was a German-American psychologist. And he was one of the pioneers in applied psychology, including his research and theories to industrial organization, legal, medical, clinical, educational, and business settings. And he was torn with his loyalty to the United States and his homeland, but that's just on the front, because behind the scenes, he was running German propaganda through the propaganda cabinet. He and Crowley didn't like each other personally at all, even though they were running around the same circles. And again, he defended a lot of Germans' actions during this war. So while he didn't get in trouble per se with the Americans, he was on the radar in some way. So Gebauer, being a part of the same German University League, also was giving Crowley access to finding out what was going on within this organization. Think about it. He's having relations with Gebauer's wife, and we all know the old saying about pillow talk. So definitely Crowley had eyes and ears in a lot of different places. And this was the appeal with Crowley being a secret agent because of his fluid sexuality. And we're going to talk today about the bisexual side of somebody else he was manipulating as well to gather information when it ties into Anthrax. So again, this guy was the perfect secret agent on so many different levels. And again, specifically with the Germans, because they were so deep into the occult themselves that Crowley represented something that they were trying to get access to. Now, not only was Crowley using Gerda to monitor Gebauer and what the Germans were up to, but she also might have been the same German prostitute that was connected to another Scarlet Woman around that time, Alice Kumaraswamy, and she was better known as Ratan Devi. And Ratan Devi was the stage name of Kumaraswamy, and she recorded Indian music and was a performer of Hindu songs and poems. And she went on all kinds of concerts and tours in Britain and America. And she's actually considered a significant woman in the music scene in the British Empire that's often overlooked. And a lot of that could have to do with her connection to the occult, because she was immediately taken with the beast and immediately fell in love with Aleister Crowley. Now, she was married to an Ananda Kumaraswamy, and he was a metaphysician, historian, and philosopher of Indian art. And he was also an early interpreter of Indian culture to the West. And he was a groundbreaking theorist, largely responsible for introducing ancient Indian art to the West. So he was bringing Indian art from India, bringing it over to America and showcasing it, and not just America, but obviously the UK and anything that would be considered the West. And also his wife, who was Ratan Devi, was a Indian musician and was a performer of Hindu songs and poems. So they were bringing an Indian part of culture to the US. So Aleister Crowley, in his Confessions, talks specifically about meeting her. And he says when he initially met her, the next act was the appearance of Ananda K. Kumaraswamy, the Eurasian critic of religion and art, and his wife, Ratan Devi, a musician from Yorkshire who had fallen in love with him and filched him from his first wife. So his first wife, Ratan Devi, pulled him away from her, and he married her, and she got access to all his money and funds and all that. But he got sick of Ratan Devi, and he actually took refuge in India, and he got fed up with having to send her supplies and wrote her to join him. And he actually hoped that when he got her there, and this is according to Crowley in his Confessions, that she would be tired of the hot climate in India and she would want to divorce him. Like, he was trying to do things to make her divorce him. And he even had her hook up with a wealthy Punjabi whom he knew personally. Again, he has got no problems with her doing whatever she wants with other men. Matter of fact, he's trying to get rid of her. So when they come to New York together, they end up meeting with Crowley. So this is Crowley's words here. His idea was to bring her out to New York. He introduced himself to me, knowing my reputation on Asiatic religions and magic. I invited them to dine and to pass the evening at my apartment so that she might sing her repertoire of Kashmiri and other Indian songs. I was charmed and promised to do all that I could to make her a success. I introduced them to several influential people and wrote a prose poem about her singing for Vanity Fair. So another major magazine that Crowley was writing for. And we'll also talk about him being in the New York Post a little bit later as well. Crowley was a very influential figure in the mainstream. I don't know if people really know that. They know Crowley's name because he's big in the mainstream now, because he's kind of the father of the modern occult movement. But he was a major figure in all of these different magazines and papers and on the socialite scenes. He was very, very much connected to all kinds of very influential people, which, by the way, if you are a secret agent, that would give you access to so much information. And not only that, he's involved with all these secret societies as well. So he pretty much had his hands in everything. So, and this is from his Confessions again, she and I lost no time about falling in love. And Crowley was big on falling in love, right? Even he would state that. As much as he would play these women, in a lot of ways, he had this very close affinity to several of them where he would fall in love instantly. And he said this suited her husband perfectly. The high cost of living was bad enough without having to pay for one's wife's dinner. All he asked was that I should introduce him to a girl who would be his mistress while costing him nothing. I was only too happy to oblige, as I happen to know a girl with a fancy for weird adventures. So we're going to show how this is going to tie back into the other woman that we talked about initially, Gerda Marie von Kothek, who was the German prostitute. So all this is going to connect. Crowley is moving these chess pieces around, these women around, because again, this is going to end up culminating with him gathering information for British intelligence. So Ratan Devi's husband is still trying to rid her, and he got to the point where he's proposing a divorce to her, according to Crowley. And Crowley even says in the confessions, I agreed with a yawn. So he said, details never interest me. But while this is going on, Crowley had helped her meet all these socialites that could put her and her musical talent to the forefront. And she ended up being a superb success. So at this point, her husband said, well, wait a minute. I don't want to divorce you now. You're making all this money. I was making all this money. Now I can have access to your money too. So he finds a way to back out of the divorce with her. Now, this irritates Crowley to no end because he is adamant on being able to do what he wants to with Ratan Devi, and he doesn't care about the divorce or not. Obviously, it bored him, but the fact that this guy backed out of it because he could see why the guy was moving back in. So this was also taking away from Crowley's access that he originally had to Ratan Devi. Now, during this time, Crowley, in his confessions, he expresses disgust with Coomaraswamy's idea of a menage a trois, which compelled his wife to share a bed with what? The German prostitute he had taken in. So we can surmise that this German prostitute, because Crowley uses this language again, that this is the same German prostitute, Gerda Marie von Kothek, that he was already messing with. So it gets a little bit deeper right here with what he is using these women for. So there's more to it than just this menage a trois that Coomaraswamy wanted from his wife and this German prostitute. The two women actually swapped confidences about Coomaraswamy, and according to Richard B. Spence, they were willing to share the information that they were extracting from Coomaraswamy to the beast. And they were both into also having relations with Crowley too. So basically what Crowley was doing, he planted this German prostitute in with Ratan Devi, and they were extracting information from Coomaraswamy, the husband of Ratan Devi, and they were bringing information back to him, which he was then bringing to British intelligence. But it's interesting, too, that he considered Coomaraswamy a black brother, and that is a member of the sinister Black Brotherhood, which is the adept of the dark arts and servitor of the German cause, which I've talked about the Black Lodge and the Black Brotherhood. And just to refresh your memory, it's a person who's on a spiritual path, and when they get to that highest level of attainment, when they can cross over the abyss into this higher spiritual consciousness, they actually stop at that end, and they don't want to sacrifice their ego, so they cling to their ego, and they return, but they still have all this power and all this information. So instead of crossing over the abyss, which, according to Crowley, he did with Newburgh in 1909. So this would be another reason why he would be irritated with Coomaraswamy, because he himself, as he stated, he was already a secret chief and he had crossed over the abyss. And that was part of the Night of Pan ritual that he had done with Victor Newburgh out in the desert. So he considered him to be one of the members of the Black Lodge, one of the Black Brotherhood, and that could be understandable to some extent, and that would play into the occult nature. But again, let me say something about Crowley. Anybody he didn't like, he said was part of the Black Brotherhood. So again, that could be part of that charlatan nature of him too, where if you didn't like somebody, he would just say that they were one of these Black Brothers of the occult, and they were drawing negative entities into any situation. But we got to look a little deeper. So Coomaraswamy was also connected to Shailendra Goza, and he was a man that Wiseman, and we talked about Sir William Wiseman on the last episode, stood accused of conniving with. So we know that when Crowley got accused of being a traitor and Sir William Wiseman got accused of being a traitor, again, they both skated. They didn't get in any trouble because they were both secretly working for British intelligence in a lot of ways that people didn't know about. But Shailandra Goza was very connected to Coomaraswamy. And Goza wrote for the Friends of Freedom, and they wrote this pamphlet called India's Freedom in American Courts. And it was a pamphlet, and it described court cases in which Indian anti-imperialists and other allies in the U.S. were put on trial for violating neutrality laws and threatened with deportation. So this was definitely against anything that the U.S. wanted out. And they actually were all arrested in San Francisco. So there's another angle that Crowley would have been trying to gather information, was the fact that Coomaraswamy was tight with Shailandra Goza. Also, another man that would have been very interested in gathering this type of information from Crowley was Robert Nathan. Now, I know last episode we talked about Major Norman Graham Thwaites, who came in 1916 to work under Sir William Wiseman. Well, there's another guy that came in there as well, and that was Robert Nathan. And Robert Nathan, actually in 1916, followed the same route that Crowley had went from Detroit to Vancouver, then down to San Francisco. So essentially, he was gathering through this covert campaign information against the Indians, Irish, and Germans with cooperation of local authorities. Now, Nathan's informants in New York he had pulled information from was this mysterious one called C. And the idea is, and this also comes from Richard B. Spence, that C stood for Crowley. And he was gathering this information from Crowley. So this whole debacle with Shailandra Goza, and we know that Goza was arrested in what? San Francisco in 1917. Who rolls through there? Robert Nathan does. And Robert Nathan is connected to Aleister Crowley. So he's gathering information from Crowley as Crowley's gathering information through Ratan Devi and the German prostitute who they're extracting the information from Coomaraswamy. At least that is the idea, right? We don't know everything for sure, but what we can gather is that Crowley is literally in the middle of all this. And we do know that he was working for British intelligence. So it's never a stretch to say that Crowley was extracting information and sending it to these guys who were then taking out anybody who was a part of the opposition. Specifically, when we've got Robert Nathan saying that he got information from a mysterious C from New York, and Crowley was in New York at the time. So now let's get to the very interesting idea of Anthrax and Aleister Crowley. Now, this would be one of the missions that I would say would be one of the failures of Aleister Crowley, but it doesn't make it any less interesting. And also, some of the occult pieces to this actually heightened it up for me a little bit more, because that's the one thing that I'm trying to do is trying to find the three pieces of Crowley and seeing how they all work. And that way we can better understand what he was actually up to. So he records that during his time in spring of 1916, he was often away in Washington. Now this is DC. And on April 1916, the 30th, the Washington Post actually ran a short article by him commenting on a recent sensational murder case involving New York dentist Dr. Arthur Warren Waite, not connected to author Edward Waite of The Golden Dawn, which I've talked about extensively. So these are two different guys. And he actually killed his in-laws, and then he tried to kill his wife with arsenic and germ cultures. And Crowley's comments were brought in to talk about what he thought about this event. And the name of the article is Dr. Waite's Wicked Man from Egypt. A modern magician and student of occult forces explains his belief that evil spirits possess us today just as they did in Old and New Testament times. Now, this is going to show you that charlatan side of Crowley, because Crowley starts talking about the Bible almost like he's a Christian here. And he knows his audience. He knows that him coming out in this particular newspaper at this time, he needs to handle this one with kid gloves. He's not trying to go full on occultist here, even though he does slide in a lot of things, which you'll see. So at the beginning of the article, it says Dr. Arthur Warren Waite, wholesale pioneer, asserted that he was irresponsibly impelled to do his murders by an evil force, a wicked and unseen man from Egypt. I've never seen him, the poisoner said. I've never heard him, though. He has lived in another ages long ago. In his reincarnation, he came to me from Egypt. Constantly, this evil spirit whispered to me, kill them, kill them. They have no right to live, kill them. Then I had to do as he told me. He would give me no rest. Now, I'm sure Crowley found this very interesting, too, because the entire religion of Thelema is built on many of the gods of Egyptian mythology and the different aspects of trying to bring about the Æon of Horus as well. So I'm sure that raised Crowley's eyebrows a lot, and the idea of this man being possessed and told by this entity that he needed to kill his in-laws and then kill his wife. So they go to interviewing Crowley, and he starts with, belief in spirits, both evil and good, are essential to belief in Christianity. Very interesting, said Mr. Crowley. If you believe in the existence of demons and are a Christian, you must believe in the power of demons to influence your acts when they have once gained a hold upon you. You are specifically warned in the Bible against the powers of evil. Demons are ever watching for a chance to get at you. You must keep them at a distance. Have no communication with that which is evil, for when you are in the power of evil one, you are lost. Very, very interesting. So then he goes on to talk about Dr. Waite. I am not well informed about the case of Dr. Waite. I believe that if I should see and talk with him, I would know whether he was actually in the power of the evil spirit he calls the man from Egypt, or is preparing cunningly for an obvious defense. But that such a thing is possible without question. I have met with such cases too often in my own practice to have any doubt. So he's basically saying, I don't know if he's lying or not, this Dr. Waite, but he's like, I've seen way too many instances of people being possessed to know that they can be. As a matter of fact, he brought on a lot of those possessions himself. So then he starts talking about magic oaths later on in this article, and he says, one may deliberately seek and obtain the powerful influence either of good or evil spirits, but it is not demons, not angels, who are most active in seeking means to exert their power unasked. Just as good is predominating quality in the generality of mankind, it is the evil spirits which exhibit the stronger initiative, realizing evidently that they have to combat powers which in the long run are superior to their own. The weak or potentially evil human character is the natural prey of demons. So he talks about how humans, when they're in their weakened state, are very susceptible to demonic entities taking them over, which I completely agree too. Now, he does go on to say how people can bring those things upon them through rituals. And he says the rituals used for this purpose are very old, based on generations of study of demon characteristics, and their potency is infallible. There's the pentagram, for example, and the magic oath. Now, he's using the pentagram and the magic oath as a way to protect yourself, which a lot of people do. And people in the occult and different Gnostic groups will say that these are items that you can use to protect yourself from these demonic entities. And he even says, by these means, devils are cast out, never to return while the subject continues to live up to the instructions of the adept. So he's talking about you need to bring an adept of the occult in to remove these demonic entities, which is absolutely backwards. But again, there's plenty of people that think that's okay. They are people out there running around saying they are white witches and white warlocks, and they are using good magic. And we know that not to be true. They're all pulling from the same pool of nefarious means, even though these entities are presenting themselves as entities of light. And he says the exorcism, of course, is applied to the demon, but at the same time, the one who was possessed is fortified against the return of the evil power. So he's saying, hey, you bring in this adept of the occult, the demonic entity won't return. And to some degree, that could be true, but I think these entities are playing a shell game, and they will act like they are gone, but they will be manifesting in a different way. And so they will be draining your power without you even knowing it. And he goes on to say at the very end of the article, if Dr. Waite can escape the responsibility of his atrocious crimes by hiding behind the man from Egypt, then our whole fabric of society and morality falls to the ground. So basically, Crowley ends up saying that regardless of whether this demonic entity possessed him to do this, he is still responsible because he allowed that demonic entity in. So another thing that I would agree with Crowley on that point, that depending on what you've done or allowed to happen, that you are ultimately responsible for what you've done to other people. But while he's there doing this whole exercise on breaking down Dr. Waite, his real trip to the Capitol was a connection with a Stuart X, and that was a pseudonym of Henry Clifford Stuart, and he was an economist who hired Crowley to edit his essays on politics and culture into a self-published book called A Prophet in His Own Country, and you can actually get this book pretty much anywhere. I saw it on Amazon as well. I don't even think it was that expensive. I don't know if I have much of an interest to read it right now outside of the fact that Crowley did the editing on it. But regardless, Stuart Henry Clifford published this collection of letters, and he did it under the pseudonym Stuart X, and that was a fictional character described as a prophet. And really the letters that were written in this fictional way were addressed to different men on various occasions, and they cover a wide range of topics: religion, politics, philosophy, social issues. So it was a way for him to express how he felt about certain issues in a fictional way. And you'll see this with many writers throughout history. It's not a new tactic, but Crowley was the one editing that. So it goes a little bit further. So again, he's having an affair with this man. And what would ultimately be the real reason for him trying to do this? Well, one, he needed money. There are other angles too. So Stuart was also using the book as propaganda to challenge Woodrow Wilson in his upcoming presidential election. So the Germans would have been looking at Stuart as a tool to be able to pump propaganda through. And obviously Crowley was tied in with the Germans, and he would have been working for the Germans, again, dually for the British, and would have been also gathering information as well. Now, what other information could he have been gathering from Stuart, or at least in the vicinity of Stuart? Well, about 5 miles from Stuart's home, there were German agents making biological weapons, and the head of that enterprise was Anton Dilger, and he was a German-American medical doctor and a main actor in the German biological warfare sabotage program during World War I. And what's interesting about him, in 1915, he comes back to the United States, cultures of anthrax and glanders. Now, if you don't know what anthrax is, it's an infection caused by the bacterium Bacillus anthracis. And this infection typically occurs by contact with the skin, inhalation, or intestinal absorption. And if you are of the age to remember, in 2001, the anthrax attacks that went down in the United States, where people were getting postal letters that had anthrax spores in them. As a matter of fact, there were 22 infected and 5 died. And there were 2 Democratic senators who also were infected with anthrax. And there were also a bunch of anthrax hoaxes that went around during that time too. Maybe I'll do an episode on anthrax and dig into what was actually going on with the anthrax craze and show you guys a little bit of what it was actually being used for, because there are some interesting security measures that were put in place that don't make a lot of sense that the anthrax craze was used for. So I think that would be a good look. And maybe I'd even do that on a lot of the short form content that I have coming out on YouTube. But we also have glanders, and glanders is a contagious zoonotic infectious disease, and it primarily occurs in horses, mules, and donkeys. And there's a reason for that. So part of what the Germans wanted to do, and even though the U.S. was neutral, they wanted to stop the U.S. from supplying the Allied forces with livestock. So they wanted to infect the livestock in the U.S., which they ended up doing to some extent with glanders. So another thing interesting with Dilger is during this U.S. biological sabotage program he was running, and it ended in late 1916, and this is when Anton returned back to Germany. But he did return to the U.S., and he also found himself under suspicion of being a German agent by the FBI, and he fled to Mexico and changed his name to Delmar. So anyway, he never really gets nailed for anything during that period of time when Crowley would have been involved. So what's interesting about that is, and we talked about propaganda cabinet, and we talked about Urs, who was a part of that, who Crowley knew. Well, guess who Urs knew? Urs knew Dilger. So Crowley goes to Washington, D.C. He is in this article about Dr. Waite and this Egyptian entity that told him to kill his wife and mother and father-in-law. He used that article to try to sniff out Urs so he could get information on Dilger. And also the fact that he was having an affair with Stewart, and they were literally 5 miles from this operation. Now, the interesting piece is, it does look like Crowley was trying to get information about this operation from the British, and he was trying to get Urs to come out because of this Waite article, because it was all about the occult. And we know that Urs was deep into the occult as well. But it looks like he failed because Dilger's germ factory was still pumping out pathogens until he returned to Germany. So he never really got nailed up. And this would be probably, again, we are trying to tie together some loose threads. But I can say that it makes sense, because why would Crowley be 5 miles from the operation? Why would Crowley be trying to attract the attention of Urs? And Urs was deep into the occult, and Urs was also tied into Dilger, and Dilger was the head of this Anthrax operation. So I found this super fascinating, especially I just find the whole Anthrax thing in 2001 interesting as well. So I thought this was pretty wild that Crowley was tied into, at least in some format, the actual pathogen anthrax. Now, another interesting piece about Crowley being a secret agent, and I thought this was interesting, about his penchant for disguises. And we're going to talk about Frances Gregg here, and she was an American poet, and her husband was Louis Wilkinson, and he was a British author, lecturer, and biographer, and he usually wrote under the name Louis Marlowe. And he met Frances Gregg in America, and she was very big on the American literary scene. But what was interesting was, when she and Wilkinson married, they were very unconventional. And I want to make that a point, because this is how Crowley is going to be brought into this too. They actually went on a honeymoon in Venice, and they brought 2 other friends with them, and they were so scandalous. They almost got thrown out of the city of Venice, which is really wild. So obviously there was a lot of, let's just say, relational things going on between all 4 of these people. But even before that, Wilkinson had met Aleister Crowley in 1907, and they became close friends after 1915. So he had already met Crowley, really liked him, and he liked a lot of what Crowley represented. Now, there are 2 different ideas of Wilkinson's involvement in magic. I have seen where he was never a follower of Crowley's teachings, and he actually said, "We hardly ever discussed magic, nor did we talk much about sex," which I don't know how much sense that makes, considering how much Crowley was involved with all that, but possibly Crowley could have been playing a whole different role with Wilkinson. But I know that there have been other writers who have written biographies about Crowley, and they talk about Wilkinson shared an interest in magic. And that was why he remained a friend to Aleister Crowley until Aleister Crowley died in 1947, which is super interesting too. So I doubt they never talked about magic. But his wife, Frances Gregg, could not stand Crowley and couldn't stand her husband's enthusiasm about Crowley. And she actually talks about an instance where Crowley was staying at their house, and she walks in and she saw this bald man at the table and freaked out. But she saw that man put on his hair and turn into Crowley. And then she noticed that Crowley carried a case full of wigs. They must have been really good wigs, because up until that point, she never knew Crowley was bald. So she went on to say to Wilkinson, her husband, that he was some sort of master criminal and involved in sinister conspiracies. Very interesting she go down that route. And on the flip side, Crowley was trying to convince Wilkinson that his wife was crazy and that she was overly imaginative of what he was doing. But I think that Crowley and his clandestine work that she thought he was up to, because again, she said that he was a master criminal, not in the way that she thought. She thought these disguises were used to perform criminal activities. Well, in some way they were, but no, these were disguises that were probably used for British intelligence or whatever intelligence operations he was working for at the time. And Crowley needed to keep that under wraps. So he was trying to get Wilkinson to disavow his wife, which none of that happened, but Wilkinson ended up staying friends with Crowley the whole time. I just thought that story was super interesting because here we are in 1916. He goes and stays with them for a little bit, and she sees him literally become Crowley because without the wigs that she would have recognized him. So obviously it could be vanity on his case for sure that he wants to wear these wigs because he's bald, but there is probably a deeper layer to it, knowing that he was a secret agent for British intelligence. Now we get to another woman that he meets in 1916, and this is Evangeline Adams, and she was an astrologer to the rich and famous. And she was based in New York City, and she had an astrological consulting business, and she gained widespread notability for defending her astrological practices in court. And she wrote a ton of very popular books to this day on astrology. But guess what? Aleister Crowley was ghostwriting her books on astrology, but she also was a heavy contributor to his Liber 536, the general practice of astrology. And it actually became somewhat of an issue in court who wrote what, because Crowley said that he wrote all of her books, and then she said that she wrote all of his book, and it ended up being that they were put down as co-authors on several, and she was at least mentioned as having something to do with Liber 536. So another interesting piece about her, and this goes into how all of these occultists, astrologers, New Agers are, interestingly enough, sometimes involved with nefarious things. And she was a big part of having several thousand of her subscribers to her astrological newsletter to follow her advice to invest in stocks, which led up to the stock market crash of 1929. So she had people dumping all this money into the stocks that they ended up losing all their money. So she was very wealthy and famous. So it makes you wonder who she was involved with that was telling her to do this. So initially, she was taken with Aleister Crowley, loved to be around him, and obviously had relations. She ended up meeting him at a soiree, and that was hosted by John Cosgrave. And I've talked about Cosgrave already in this series, but Crowley talks about him a lot in the Confessions. And he was an editor for World, and he was big in pumping out British propaganda. So he was the opposite of the German propaganda papers. And he was tied in with Felding and John Quinn and some of these other guys. And you know, John Quinn, he was the art piqueur that Crowley moved in with when he first came to New York in 1914. And Cosgrave was also a friend with Norman Thwaites. And we talked about Norman Thwaites on the last episode too. So he also may have been at that same gathering where Crowley ended up meeting with Evangeline Adams. So it's very interesting. Crowley was there with a bunch of people who were tied into German propaganda and also Allied editors. So Crowley was keeping tabs on all of these guys at the same time where he met this woman, Evangeline Adams. Now, so later on in 1916, Crowley ends up moving to Lake Pasquaney, and this is now called Newfound Lake today. And he took a magical retirement until early of 1917. And at this cabin, Evangeline Adams actually owned it. And this is where he was doing heavy drugs. and he did a ton of rituals while he was there. This is when he started calling himself Master Therion, and this is when he moved into another magical level, again, according to him. Also, while he's staying at Lake Pasquaney, he sees some weird stuff while he's there. He ends up seeing a dazzling globe of electric fire during a thunderstorm. Now, people think that it was probably what we call ball lightning now. I don't know about that. Not with all the stuff Crowley was doing out there. And I'm about to get into some very interesting stuff that Crowley was doing out there. And also, this does tie into some of his secret agent work as well, because he was not very far from Boston, which he was able to get to fairly easily as well. So I don't think Crowley was just taking a quote unquote retirement. I think he was doing what he normally did when it came to the occult. He was taking a sabbatical to learn more magic, to learn more of the occult practices, and again, move up to another level of occult mastery. So he settles in there by about mid-June of 1916, and he does this to also renew and strengthen his connections with spiritual forces. And he wanted to stop degrading himself by working at anything, whatever. So he was tired of working for Stewart, writing for Vanity Fair and some of these other magazines and papers, and even writing for Evangeline Adams, who put him up there at the cabin. So he just needed a break, essentially, but he also wanted to really focus on magic while he was there. And he devoted himself to meditation writing. And this weird Liber comes out of it called Liber 70, the Cross of a Frog. Now, I'm going to tell you now, I'm going to go into it a little bit, but I'm not going to go into it fully, because one of the things I'm not going to do is just read an entire ritual on this show. I don't find that to be something, one, that's very godly, but I will explain it in the best way that I can. I will say that there are some rituals that I run across when I'm doing this type of research that just make my skin absolutely crawl. And not to say that any of them are good, but some of them just make your skin crawl worse than others. And this is one of those ones, and it is called the Cross of a Frog. And it is to obtain a familiar spirit of a nature as described in the Apocalypse of St. John the Divine from a frog or toad, is what it states at the beginning of this. And it immediately made me think of Kek, who is a deification of a concept of primordial darkness. And this is in the ancient Egyptian Ogdoad, the cosmogony of Hermopolis. And this is the frog-headed god, and this is where we get Pepe from, the meme frog, and this is all tied into Kek. So it made me think about that because of the fact that he had these connections to Egyptian gods and goddesses, and he intertwined them into his own religion of Thelema. Now, what he ends up doing is pronouncing himself to be the chief officer that represents a snake, because of the god Mercury. And then he goes into the idea that the proper food of snakes is frogs, and he catches this frog. Now, he goes into baptizing this frog, and he uses the Christian method of doing that. And he talks about Jesus a lot in this, and not in a great way at all. And that's as far as I'm going to go with that, because he really gets specific of basically using the frog as a representation of Jesus Christ. And he crucifies this frog. And he, as the beast, Megatherion, at this point he's calling himself, and he actually calls Jesus the slave god. And he says that he should be mocked and spat upon and scourged and crucified. So he's actually doing a reenactment of what actually happened to Jesus, but he is calling Jesus the false god while he's doing it. And he ends up, when he takes this frog off of this little cross that he crucifies him on, he divides it into two parts, and he cooks it and eats it. And so he has used this frog to consume finally the Æon of the Accursed One, is the goal of this Cross of the Frog ritual. Again, it's pretty graphic, and I'm not going into like how to do this ritual, and I think it's absolutely despicable, coming from me, who is a Christian. But again, Crowley's not a good dude. And I want to say that as many times as I can as I'm doing this series, that as much as I find him fascinating in his machinations as a secret agent and then an occultist, and who he was as a charlatan and all the people that he was connected to and what he was actually doing, I don't sign off on anything he was doing. As a matter of fact, the guy was very despicable in a lot of ways. And not to say that I wouldn't wish redemption on him while he was alive, just as I would anyone else right now. I don't care how despicable they are. I think that we need to have that level of empathy and love in us to want people to turn from their evil ways. And I would hope that as Christians, all of us should want that. But again, I'm not signing off on this guy. And this was one of those rituals that really made my skin crawl when I read it. But this is what he's doing out here in the woods in this cabin, or around this cabin that Evangeline Adams is letting him stay at. And also part of him getting away from New York was to get away from Ratan Devi. As a matter of fact, Ratan Devi ends up becoming pregnant with his child. So her husband, Coomaraswamy, is not the one who got her pregnant. It's actually Crowley, and Crowley is not really down with this, because around this time he's found out that C.S. Jones is his spiritual son, and he doesn't need to have an actual physical child to be what he believes to be his successor. He believes C.S. Jones at this point is his successor. So he says in Confessions chapter 77, the situation was complicated by her becoming pregnant. This changed my attitude. I still refused to interfere with her will, but now I was prepared to make any sacrifice necessary to ensure her welfare and that of our child. So he wants to take care of the child. He wants to take care of her, but he doesn't really want to be around her unless she wants to be around him. He's kind of giving her the choice. You know, he's all about free will. So he says she was making quite a lot of money by now, so he pestered her day and night, talking about her husband, whenever he could spare a moment from the German prostitute, who we've already talked about, with whom he was now living, having been thrown out by my eccentric friend. He had queer ideas, had the eminent mongrel. The cost of a double room being slightly less than that of two single, he effected a prudent economy by putting this girl in the same bed with his wife when he was out of town. So Coomaraswamy was just as diabolical as Crowley was. It's funny how Crowley is talking down on him and saying, this guy's part of the Black Brotherhood. Well, he's doing the same thing as you, Crowley. You're just not liking the fact that you're not in complete control of the situation. And you'll see that time and time again with Crowley. So then he goes on to talk about Devi, and he says, Devi was one of those women whose chief pleasure is to show her power over men. She tried it on me, but a bath brick would have done quite as well. So Crowley is saying that I'm always in control. No woman's going to control me. And frankly, I don't see too many instances, if any, that Crowley was ever controlled by really anyone but British intelligence. And even then, that's shoddy at best when you look at him being involved with other agencies, not always doing what the British wanted. I mean, just look at the whole Statue of Liberty thing. The British didn't sign off on that. He did that on his own. They ended up getting him out of it by saying that he was traitorous and acting like he was going to get in trouble, but they didn't do anything to him. So he says, convinced after many desperate efforts that I would not run after her or even walk her way, she began to understand true love, to recognize me as her master and quit playing the fool. She did not divine that my Gibraltar firmness was calculated policy. I really loved her, and I knew that the only hope of making her love me was to kill the vanity which prevented her from being true to herself and giving her whole heart. So he said, I needed to make sure she knew that I'm in control. That way she knows that's how to love somebody. So interesting stuff from Crowley. So what ends up happening is, before he leaves to go to the cabin that Evangeline Adams owns, he had a farewell meeting with Devi, and she was way too pregnant to be appearing in public anymore. And her husband persuaded her to go to England for a type of confinement. Basically, hey, you're pregnant, you're going to stay in this house and come with me. So he also was trying to lure her there by saying that he was actually going to get the divorce, and he wanted to allow Crowley to have access to the child and Devi. But really, he had a very different motive. and he knew that she was not good on ships. And because of that, she ends up getting on this ship and loses the baby. And he goes on to say that even still, that they talked to each other through telegrams, and that they had talked about getting back together at some point, but never did. And obviously, he is in Newfoundland, hanging out by the lake. And this is just, I believe, part of Crowley's game, even with women and men, that he might have loved them to some extent. But I mean, how much can you when you're involved with so many different nefarious aspects, specifically with very negative entities? So how does this tie into the secret agent part? Well, while he's there, it doesn't look like he abandoned his intelligence work at all. And during that summer, he actually found opportunities to visit Boston, and that was only a few hours away, which I talked about. And he talks about in his diary meeting with a French-Canadian prostitute there, and he had a couple of anonymous homosexual encounters, and they were all connected to sex magic operations. But while he's there, another person that was not far away in Cambridge, which was the home of a guy that he didn't like very much, but also he needed to keep tabs on, was Dr. Munsterberg. And we talked about him. He's the German-American psychologist, and he was tied into the propaganda cabinet, and he was still fully engaged in his pro-German ideas. And Crowley, being able to go back and forth to Boston, he would have been able to keep an eye on Hugo Munsterberg while he was there. So this was also another way that he could funnel information to the British. Because think about it, he wanted to take his sabbatical, his quote unquote magical retirement, while he's not really retiring from magic, but he is recharging his magical energy essentially. But he's still working for British intelligence. He still has to be giving them information and funneling it back to them. So he's at a place where he's not that far away from Boston. He's not that far away from Hugo Munsterberg. And from all indications, it looked like he was still keeping an eye on him and giving the British whatever information he could, because again, he's out for himself, but he still needs to get paid by the British, and he's under their thumb too. So he is doing whatever he can to keep on as many hats as he possibly can and keep running the game. And that's what Crowley has been doing since the onset, in my opinion, of his father dying. And obviously him going to Trinity College in Cambridge really set him on the path of what he ended up becoming. And I think this is a good place to stop today. Again, this is an ongoing series. We have plenty more parts that are going to be added to this, but this is just another piece of the puzzle of Crowley being this secret agent. And this was his connection to Anthrax and various occult practices at the same time. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I really love the fact that you guys have been hanging out with me for about a year and a half now. And we're in the new year, and we are looking for a really good 2026. Listen, guys, if you haven't, go give this show a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple. If you're on Apple, please go write a good review as well. It really helps the show get further out to other people, so then they can see it and then they can share it to other people as well. And share the show, guys. If you're on YouTube, go give it a nice comment below, like, subscribe, hit the notifications, and make sure you're sharing the show. At the end of the day, that's the most important thing. Share the show. On the way out, guys, we're going to play my song, Joel's Psalm. And you know what it is, guys. Go outside, touch grass, and get your tail out the hole.
I feel lost, I feel wrong. The tears are the sun. Cannonballs to the cesspool. And you know I'ma need you today. And you know I'ma need you today. Oh yeah. These parts are lonely, but these parts don't know me. I'm not alone with you. I'm not alone with you. I'm not alone with you. Substituting the pain like I'm pumping aspartame on my veins while I'm numbing these pieces of me. What I create in these songs and the pain is cold, but seasonally I'm crying, looking for signs. I need a theophany. Everything encompassing me isotropically, and nothing I seem to do is working out. Who is spotting me? I feel like they're mocking me. Where is the God in me? I feel like I'm dried up hominy, and all I want is Christ, not theology. People are nitpicking, bickering over the Bible while people are dying in front of them. And you wonder why people are running from the guy that you say that is shunning them. I felt it myself. They told me to look somewhere he's not. Up in the stars, up in the sky, up in the clouds, like he's not around. So I empty myself with every distraction. Got dry by my tires, a ball can't get any traction. Where's compassion? We following kings, but they only from Akron. Whoa. I just know that we're more than what they tell us. We're overzealous when we protect what is precious. We get confused when those things start to propel us into things we don't want to do, leave us helpless. There's only one who gives us peace when we are restless. I know that now.